Hello and welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. My name is Tony Groves and today I'm one third in our continued series of podcasts asking about an alternative Ireland and what we can do to change it. Remember folks, the Echo Chamber podcast is a free-flowing conversation that may occasionally touch on mature subjects. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Martin McMahon. How are you, Martin?
How you doing, Tony?
More importantly, we're delighted to be joined in the Tortoise Shack by Assistant Professor, Lecturer in Gender Studies at UCD, Mary McAuliffe. Mary is a former president of the Women's History Association of Ireland and she's a tireless feminist activist. She's also a great follow on Twitter, by the way. Mary, thanks for coming in onto the podcast.
It's great to be here and I've listened to your podcast, so I'm delighted to be part of it.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Mary. We're delighted to have you on because I think it's fair to say you are a very inconvenient voice for some people.
Oh yes, I think so, and I hope I get more inconvenient as the years go by. I've been a feminist activist and a gender historian since my professional career began, but I think feminism for me was the way into everything I do on Twitter or within my career. Reading first at 19, reading Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, and I never looked back from then.
Feminism is the prism you look through pretty much everything at.
Absolutely, and obviously my feminism has changed over the years as I have matured, and I would have moved from different phases of feminism, as most feminists do, and I think this is a misunderstanding of inconvenient feminist voices, that we can change and mature and allow a broadening and more nuanced view with our feminist lens as we get, I won't say older, more mature.
But that's we spoke before we started that, you know, we both said, we just read that Mary Beard's book on women in power.
Yeah.
And, you know, we talk about the prism of seeing feminism, and she opens that book by basically saying the tone was set back in the Greco-Roman days where I can't even recall the young emperor telling his mother to go to bed. This is the man's work now was more or less the what we allude to, and you know that set a template for what begets many of our norms, our cultural norms, you know, and it also begets a thing there where what you've just said, Martin, called an inconvenient feminine voice. But I think the other point is that if a woman tends to raise her voice, they can be told, stop whinging.
Stop whining. Yes,
Stop whining.
I actually, somebody tweeted that at me yesterday, that I was being whiny about the fact that I was giving out about the Dublin City Council's impending decision to allow a hotel chain develop the Magdalene Laundry site on Sean McDermott Street, which I think is absolutely awful decision to make. It is again obliterating the marginalised histories of women who were incarcerated there over the decades, for over 100 years. All those women whose voices, whose trauma histories, whose experiences are inconvenient. And I like that word, actually, that you started it with, that they're inconvenient. I think it's someone like Mary Beard is also an inconvenient voice, and she gets trolled on Twitter, obviously. But what she's talking about is, of course, the patriarchy. And I think we don't use the word, that P word, often enough. We still live in a patriarchal culture where privilege goes with the male gender. And of course there is the argument that, you know, poor men, working class men, black men aren't as privileged or as middle class white women, for example. But I think that's a very singular take on it. You have to be more nuanced than that. Being a man in a patriarchal society, no matter your race or class, gives you more privilege than the woman who would be standing beside you as a working class woman, or as a woman of colour, or as a LGBT woman.
Yeah.
And I think understanding that the politics and power of the patriarchy still operate. You know, feminism has only just tinkered about the edges of the patriarchy. We've discovered spaces in which we can fit ourselves. So we're given equality measures and legislation. Yeah. But the thing that hasn't changed is the culture. The culture of seeing women's voices, having opinions. Opinionated women are often seen as screechy and whiny. And
ball breakers.
Exactly, and witches, burn the witches. You know, we don't burn witches anymore, but we try and burn them on Twitter and things like that. So those inconvenient voices are constantly being shut down.
But, okay, you mentioned the Magdalene Laundries and the history there, and I have to say, you know, we've obviously been banging the drum on the homeless thing that's been carrying on here for the last, we've been campaigning to try and raise the...
the level of awareness, to get a consensus that this is not normal.
And the most important thing that's I think it was Rory raised the point when we spoke to him last week, that he said, calling something a family hub gives it a kind of... That was almost the most feminist connotation they could put on it, that had the idea. But, you know, realistically then, the other language around rough sleepers, where you've nearly 9,000 people homeless, and the majority of them are women and children. And we talk about it in the context, through the prism of feminism and through the prism of the Magdalene Laundries and this state's long history of a patriarchal culture. Are we just creating the conditions to show that we learned nothing from history?
Well, if we look at the crash and the austerity politics that came after the crash, in the very initial stages, obviously the construction industry collapsed, and it was young men that mostly suffered the effects of the crash. But after that, and the austerity politics that were followed by this government in saving the banks and the developers and namifying everything, those who were affected most and who suffered most were single-parent-headed families, and the majority of single-parent-headed families are headed by women. So it's women and children who suffered the most egregious effects of austerity politics. Women in communities where the community centre was closed down, where community creches, those hours were cut back because the community creches were no longer getting enough money to employ enough people to keep them open long hours. The cut in children's allowances, the demand that these parents who are heading single-parent-headed families go out and find work where no work was.
There was an amazing phrase, and I know Joan Burton, much to her betrayal of the working class, used this phrase all the time. She called these things labour activation mechanisms. Labour activation mechanisms, drive me crazy, because the idea that you have a single-parent-headed family where children may be in school or not in school if they're younger, who looks after these kids? If there's no creche, if there's no community creche, people who are looking for work that fits around also caring for a family are going to be probably working at the social service or the lower income end of the scale, 0-hour contracts, very low wage contracts, etc., etc. How do you pay then for somebody to care for your parents? And then it falls back on the grandparents, particularly grandmothers. So now you have 2 or 3 generations of families being brought into play where the state's policies affects their quality of life, affects how they live. It means you're squishing a couple of generations of families into family homes because there isn't enough social housing being built. You're putting them into these family hubs. Sorry, I aired that. And I agreed with everything Rory said about the family hubs. These are not spaces. They're supposed to be short-term, but we know they're not going to be short-term. They're going to be long-term. You're going to have families who will grow up in those family hubs. Same as like the asylum centres were supposed to be short-term.
And it was actually Rory said that to us, or was it Lorcan who said it to us, that he was at a meeting where it was said that family hubs are actually a solution to the homelessness problem. And that's never what they were intended to be. We've decided to change our lexicon here on this. We are not using family hub anymore. We're using homeless hub. It's far more descriptive.
You could use the term warehousing of people that the government just doesn't want to know about because they're not the lobbyists, they're not the developers, or they're not the people who they consider their people and who they need to work for.
And do you see that 20 years, 30 years from now, we will be looking back at these homeless hubs in the same way that we look back at the Magdalene Laundries and we say, that was so wrong. How did that happen? Are we just heading straight back into this again?
Oh, absolutely. I think, again, we were speaking earlier about most people would say we actually don't learn from history. And we know the histories of the Magdalene Laundries or the mother and baby homes or the industrial schools where I think it was Mannix Flynn who said the industrial schools were where people who were convicted of poverty were put, young children. Magdalene Laundry was about controlling women's bodies. We're still doing that, obviously, in our legislation in terms of reproductive rights. So we warehouse them. We warehouse all these inconvenient bodies because we don't want to deal with them. Somehow they offend our sense of respectability or morality or purity. Or our idea that Ireland needs to be going forward, pulling on the green jersey. So poverty is still a crime. Poverty is still considered inconvenient. Same with the way Leo Varadkar, before he became Taoiseach, ran that awful campaign around welfare cheats, which they've now admitted was wrong. And the whole concept...
But it helped him...
of course there are some welfare cheats. That's the nature of humanity. But the idea that all people who are on social welfare are potentially cheats...
Well, the narrative around... I actually met with Minister Doherty to do with bogus self-employment. And I explained that bogus self-employment is costing many, many multiples of social welfare claimant fraud. And what are you doing about it?
So it's tax loopholes that the white-collar taxpayers
Facebook have just admitted yesterday that they've been using Ireland as a tax haven, and they're now going to try and pay a little bit more tax where the actual goods and services are provided. Interestingly, what really bothered me was how that was reported. It was like IBEC wrote the bloody editorials because it came out and it said as if the death knell for the Irish golden goose because we're not going to get our tax base is going to be shrunk. Now, transfer pricing works on the basis that Facebook park their intellectual property in Ireland, sell goods in Germany, but then tax it down over here, and we don't collect the tax. There's an easy solution, guys. Just if you're going to have transfer pricing, make Facebook employ more people, and they can transfer as much back here as they want. Where the jobs are, where the goods and services are produced, that's where you pay the tax. So we shouldn't be actually saying this as a... it was reported yesterday disgracefully, I thought. I
think it's really interesting the way language is used around how we separate out the people in society, and where social welfare recipients are seen as having a potential moral hazard. If you give them too much money, they won't go out and get a job. For me, you look at, during the Celtic Tiger, there was 3% unemployment.
I think then 4.6.
Yeah, 4.6 or something very, you'll always have that.
Well, statistically, it was full employment.
Yes, it was full employment. Then the crash came, it goes up to 15%. That means all of those people were working before the crash came, and many of them have gone back into employment. There is no moral hazard about paying people a decent social welfare allowance so they can live some quality of life.
We have, and the OECD reports show this time and time again. We have the biggest wealth inequality in the OECD without social transfer. So without children's allowance and HAP payments and what Rory effectively called corporate welfare, where you hand the money to someone to pay family income supplement to hand to a private landlord to cover their money. So what we actually really have, and doesn't get said back to that response, Mary, is that what we have is so many people so vulnerable to poverty. Because without it, they're right there on the breadline.
Yeah.
Well, I know in Canada they did a study recently. It was a very small study, but single mothers, they gave them $20 extra over a period of time, and then measured the results over a longer time for the improvement for both the mother and child. And just $20 a week made a massive difference in that over a period of time they became net contributors.
Yeah.
Where those who didn't get the $20 remained in the poverty trap. They were stuck in it, couldn't get out of it. Whereas the $20 extra just gave that little bit of leeway for childminding, for going to college, whatever it was, that took them out of the poverty trap.
We see that. I work in gender studies in UCD, and we have an outreach certificate and diploma in women's studies and social justice that we go out into the community and deliver, and I do the women in history module of that. So I've been doing that for as long as I've been in UCD, and we do it in Clondalkin and Crumlin. We've gone down the countries to places like Longford and Mullingar and Clara and up to Donegal and places like that. So we would have maybe 20 women in a classroom over a course of 18 months getting their certificate and diploma. And out of that, these are women who left school at 14, 15, went into the workplace, might be still working, but might be on social welfare or single parent allowance or things like that, coming back into education. And there is almost 100% employment out of those courses. You give somebody a chance, you give them $20 extra, you give them a chance to access an educational course. Doesn't necessarily have to be gender studies and social justice. It can be a professional training course. But the interesting fact, we have done studies on the effect, because it's been going on now for about 15 years in UCD through gender studies. And we did a study on it. Not only were most of the women who weren't older and who were just doing it out of interest gone back into working, and an awful lot of them in community activism, in NGOs, in giving back, to the communities. Some of them have gone on further in universities, got BAs, masters, PhDs. The next generation, their children, have also gone on to third level and have been the first in their families to do that straight from secondary school. So it has a knock-on effect.
And that is one of the biggest indicators on whether you're going to go to college or not is, did your parents go to college?
Absolutely. And, the short-termism of our political masters is incredible to me. To actually take funding from education, from community education particularly, from programmes nutrition programmes, all that sort of thing, saves money in the short term, but the effects down the line are going to necessitate spending more money, say, on healthcare, on train back to education courses, on all that sort of thing.
Well, they do seem to, when the crunch comes, it's the most vulnerable that get hammered, and indeed it was the traveller community that probably got the hardest hammering in social spending. I mean, they were absolutely gutted on their social spending. And just last night we had John Connors on
Tonight TV3.
Tonight TV3, and John Connors, thank you, John. John laid it up there and said, we are dealing with psychopathic cultures within government. And both Tony and I are very impressed by John for having the chutzpah to say that.
Absolutely. I mean, the intolerant attitudes of both national and local politicians towards traveller communities, about housing, about education, about, this idea that those communities, again, are inconvenient and everybody just wants them to go out of their area, go somewhere else. I mean, the shocking response to the Carrickmines tragedy by local communities and by politicians after they did the whole thoughts and prayers to quote the American thing, was horrendous. It's like travellers are criminalised much more so than the settled population. Travellers are seen as problematic. There's no idea that traveller populations have a culture that is very rich in language and is very rich in their histories, and that culture just needs a little bit of help, and that's it.
And the driving force for change in the traveller culture at the moment is actually women.
It's women. Actually, I saw yesterday on a tweet that a young traveller woman, whose name I can't remember, but she's been in the newspaper, she did an internship with a Democratic politician in America, has just been accepted on a master's course in human rights.
I saw it. I know the tweet.
In UCD, and that's fantastic. You just give people of any community, traveller communities, under pressure, socioeconomically communities, asylum seekers, anybody, give them a bit of help, and they will succeed. That $20 or €20 is something that can make all the difference.
Yeah, it's little things.
It's the little things.
One of those little things, Mary, is the Phoenix Hospital. That's something you've spoken about quite a lot. Will you fill us in on why you feel so strongly? It's the new National Children's Hospital. I won't use the term Phoenix, because now obviously it's not going to be called the Phoenix Children's Hospital, because Phoenix Children's Hospital Arizona have said they'll sue otherwise. When did this come out? A couple of days ago. Oh, very nice. And it was always a really silly name. I mean, I have no idea how they spin-doctored that up into existence. It should be called after a great doctor, a great feminist, rebel, 1916 rebel, a trade union activist and socialist, Dr. Kathleen Lynn.
who in 1919 set up St Ultan's Hospital for Sick Infants with her partner, Magdalene French Mullen. They employed women doctors, they employed obviously women nurses. An awful lot of the nurses they employed in the initial phase of the hospital, actually, St Ultan's, were women that Kathleen Lynn had trained in first aid as part of the Irish Citizen Army. And of course, if you were in the Irish Citizen Army, you had to be a member of a trade union. So these women are coming, they're working class women. Lynn herself comes from a very middle class Protestant background. Her father was a vicar. She's born in County Mayo. But through feminism, through cultural nationalism, through trade union activism, through friendship with James Connolly, her, like my own feminism, her feminism and her socialism developed and radicalised over the early decade of the 20th century. And by the time they set up St Ultan's, they are committed activists, herself and Magdalene French Mullen. And they're partners as well. So I think that's very interesting in light of our passing of the marriage equality referendum. Here are two women who spend their lives together, who are activists together, who worked every single day of their lives for the children of inner city Dublin, the children of the tenements. They took those children, they were horrified at the poverty, at the hunger, the starvation those children were living in, at the awful diseases, the preventable diseases they were dying in. And they employed women like Dr. Dorothy Stopford Price, who introduced, who began the whole eradication of TB way before Dr. Noel Brown did. And while he's rightfully credited with things, have either of you ever heard of Dorothy Stopford Price?
No, I haven't.
There is a biography of hers out, actually, so go and read it. She's a fantastic woman. And Lynn actually had the idea to set up a National Children's Hospital. It was designed by Michael Scott, the architect. It would have been built where St Ultan's was in Charlemont Street, along that stretch of canal between Charlemont Street Bridge and Rathmines, the bridge into Rathmines. Beautiful, Michael Scott was a great architect, so beautiful design. And one of my favourite anti-heroes of all these stories, the Archbishop of Dublin, John Charles McQuaid, got in the act. And of course, he didn't want to approve of a hospital that would be secular, wouldn't have the Catholic ethos. Lynn, of course, is Protestant, as was French Mullen. Women running a hospital. Women shouldn't have any control over medicine or education or their bodies or things like that, according to John Charles and according to many of his successors, I would say, in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, as we well know from the fights over the new National Maternity Hospital. So they lost that opportunity in St Ultan's to become the new National Children's Hospital. Now we have this building going in St James's, and whatever you think about the right or wrong of that, it's going ahead.
Yes.
And I think it is, we're in the decade of centenaries. We're commemorating the contribution of many of our forefathers and foremothers to the revolutionary period and to the foundation of our modern state. Whatever we think about that state today, but at least they were fighting for something. And Lynn was fighting for equality, for access to proper medicine for the poor of Dublin, and then for the poor of the country. It's only right and proper it should be called after her.
And you've started an online petition.
I didn't actually start the petition. I was about to, and then somebody else had started it, but I tweet that. I've signed the petition.
We'll tweet it out after the show.
We'll put it out after the
and
show.
Yes, and I think the more people who write letters, the more people who tweet about it, sign the petition, I think it's only the right and proper thing to do. We succeeded in getting one bridge over the River Liffey, called after a working class trade union rebel activist, Rosie Hackett. Now it's Kathleen Lynn's turn.
Well, it's amazing because you talk to the Phoenix Hospital. We all talk about the fact that you go to the private sector. We have the Beacon Hospital. You know, every bloody ad tells you that you have to go to the Beacon. Every other ad tells you that no couple can conceive now because every other ad. I hate to say it, but there's an industry building up around actual. People just been saying, "Oh, come to the Beacon. Come for your reproduction needs for this. Come for your don't wait in a queue. Don't be in the public health service. Don't be in this." And when you think of a word like the phoenix and you think of the word like the beacon, it just echoes it's
privatisation.
Yeah, it sticks in my throat.
While I'm not given to conspiracy theories, I think
fire ahead.
I think it's strange. I think there could be something there to the fact that there is this move towards privatization of our educational system. I work in the university sector, and we're now supposed to be a business that make money, and we are a service industry to our clients, and all this language of business is being used about education, which horrifies me absolutely. I also think there is a move towards privatization of medicine in this country, and you're right about the Beacon. It'd be easier to privatise the Phoenix Children's Hospital than it would be the Kathleen Lynn Children's Hospital. Exactly. Because if you're against privatisation, you can use Kathleen Lynn and her life and her story as a hook around which
she wouldn't have stood for
you could start a campaign against privatisation.
You can't privatise a hospital that's named after Kathleen Lynn. You can't.
No, you just can't be, and we also have the James Connolly Hospital it's in Blanchardstown, is it?
Yes, it is, yeah.
So, there's a precedent there of calling it after a socialist, a hospital after a socialist, and a feminist, as Connolly called himself, and a 1916 rebel and a member of the Irish Citizen Army.
You wrote a paper actually with the 77 women of the 1916 Rising.
It's a whole book.
Huh? I've only read the synopsis. I'm a Cliff Notes kind of guy when I'm doing my research, but yeah. So you look at that in the context of it's great for you to come on today and actually give us shine a bit of a light on some of these topics. But I suppose we talked about Twitter, and we always go back to Twitter because we're
Twitter based.
Yeah.
And you gave us the great ones this last week when we had the
Taylor Swift. Name a badder bitch than Taylor Swift, and I think you named
the baddest one. Although I saw some other bad ones that are really good ones actually as well. Yes, I tweeted about Granuaile.
Which I can't pronounce still.
Yeah, Grace O'Malley, the 16th century pirate queen, they call her.
But somebody hasn't made a movie.
I think there have been some TV programs, and there's a great musical by Rita Connolly is the singer. I forget who wrote the music, but there's a great music about it.
I remember thinking once that you could have a synopsis. I think when they had 4 weddings and a funeral.
Yeah,
she was kind of similar, didn't she? She
married 3 times, I think. And apparently the myth is that one of her husbands she got rid of by locking the door to their castle and calling down from the battlements, "I dismiss you."
Yeah, sent him
3
off.
times and sent him off along his way, and kept the castle, which is now called the Hens Castle.
Yeah.
But with the 77 women, I must mention my co-author Liz Gillis, who's a great local historian. And the 77 women was a really interesting project to work on, because it wasn't just the book, but in Richmond Barracks now there's a permanent exhibition based on the 77 women of 1916 with a quilt, and this is where history and community activism can connect. 77 modern day women, most of them feminists, community activists, some of them coming from our community outreach program based in UCD that I mentioned earlier, took one of the 77 women who were out in 1916 and responded to it across 100 years of activism and ideas around feminism and women's rights and women's position in society, and how far have we come and how much more do we have to do to get true equality in our society. And we still have a huge mountain to climb in achieving that. And that was very interesting to work with those women and with the artist Mariam Quist and with the Richmond Barracks. And it's there permanently on exhibition, so go and visit and have a look. Put a plug in for Richmond Barracks, because we're going to continue on in the Richmond Barracks space of looking at women through the prism of feminist history.
Yeah.
And of course, next year is the 100th anniversary of women getting the vote.
Yes.
In Ireland. It was a limited franchise. It was only over the age of 30.
There was an interesting thing on last night I saw, it's not last night, a couple of days ago I saw with the Roy Moore failing to get elected in Alabama. And so we're all supposed to be celebrating this morning because he lost by literally
1%.
Yeah, I know, it's awful.
But to make matters worse, there's an old statement he made, not that old, a couple of years ago, where he thought every amendment after the 10th in the US,
which includes the right to women to vote. I think he made that in 2005 or 2006.
It's only over just over a decade, and he didn't want women to have the vote.
There are a couple of people in Ireland who have tweeted about that, including several people who are on the anti-repeal the Eighth Amendment movement, who have jokingly, perhaps not so jokingly, tweeted that the amendment or the laws that gave women the right to vote should perhaps be rescinded.
Isn't it, and we did discuss this briefly, isn't it strange that the Irish right is aping the Trump right? I find it very strange, and their tactics, their way of engaging, they are simply aping what's already been done there. We see it particularly in Repeal the Eighth. We see it particularly the same arguments coming up, the same arguments that are in America coming up here.
Well, I think a lot of those who are, particularly the leadership, they seem to have been trained in the American tactics, and they're getting, I imagine, a lot of money in from America, because of course this is seen as the last bastion. Same happened with the equality referendum. Ireland was the last bastion of anti-gay legislation.
Yes,
this is the last bastion of anti-women's reproductive rights legislation, and those battles have been lost in most of Western Europe at this stage. And so this is where you make your stands, a bit like Custer last stand, over and over and over again. And let's hope, like Custer, they will fail as well.
I agree with you, and I just think but Martin is right to point out that we have the same tactics, the same language, the same vile
racism,
homophobia, bigotry, homophobia,
misogyny. It's all there, and there has been a rise recently in that awful National Party.
Yes,
when they met down, I thought it was ironic, in Trump Doonbeg.
They follow Martin.
I got followed last night by the National Party.
Yes.
And I assiduously avoid, because I can get very angry at these people.
I wonder why.
and I don't like to be drawn into it, because I'll get into bad language and I will get very narked over it. And also noticed the three of us spoke.
You don't want your blood pressure going up either.
Yeah, I try, I try not to. But we also spoke that the rise of the bot armies now, and we've seen it, and it is happening. It is happening. So to me, and most of these are politically motivated bots that are set up by political groups or and it's a lot of them mainstream political groups that are doing this.
And they are targeting people who are particularly political, who are from a particular political perspective, usually on the left, and they are targeting people on specific subjects. So they're targeting on nationalism or the who gets to be Irish.
Yes,
and this has really exercised me, I must say, in the last year or so. These accounts that have been set up that are about the true Gael and the true Irish, ethno-nationalism and all that sort of thing. I mean, being a historian, how do you define Irishness? I studied medieval and early modern history, and you would talk then about the several different types of communities that were in Ireland then. The Old English, the Anglo-Irish, the Gaelic Irish, who were all in tribal, were divided. There was no such thing as a united Ireland. The New English, the Ulster Scots, the Vikings. I mean, my surname, supposedly, McAuliffe, comes from Olaf, so somewhere back there was a little Viking. I'm sure he was short and dark, not tall and blonde.
Oh, I'm sure he was tall and blonde.
Yes. And all of that sort of, diversity. They've recently done a genetic DNA study that shows, French, Breton, Viking. Yeah. We're a mix. our ancient myths talk about a book of or a series of invasions. The Largoala, the Book of Invasions.
Well, actually,
so who is really Irish?
I ran into a little bit of bother with this on one of the podcasts because I referred to the Irish were mongrels.
Well, they're a bit,
but that's the human race as well.
But it's great diversity.
There's no such thing as purity.
And it's great diversity. And then these people saying, oh, you're not real Irish. I mean, myself and Tony were out for the podcast over the weekend, and I got a taxi, and the chap driving the taxi is Nigerian, and we're talking homelessness, and we're talking access to homes. That guy is as Irish as I am. I don't care what anybody says. His kids are going to school. He's living here. He's working here. He wants to buy a house here. He wants to contribute here. What makes him not Irish?
Nothing makes him not Irish, except in the minds of those very narrow-minded.
I go back to one point. If you're an employer, you can't discriminate on grounds of race, sex. There's the seven heads, and yet we can feel free to say place of birth, and that's a continual kickback. And they would say, because we come up with these horrible phrases like economic migrants.
Yes.
And that which begets.
What do you think we were in the 19th and into the most of the 20th century, and we still are? There was a very good cartoon I saw, and it's sometime around the 1880s in an American newspaper that shows a kind of a workhouse-shaped boat coming over to New York, full of obviously poverty-stricken, diseased Irish. And they are, this is coming to our shores. The Irish were couched in the same language that Trump is using about the Mexicans today in the late 19th century. If you look at Kings of New York, that whole anti-Irish phenomenon that was very much part of 19th century American society and into the 20th century. And then the Catholic thing, of course, because American is a Protestant country, and so Catholics were treated with suspicion. John F. Kennedy had to say deliberately that he would not govern as a Catholic president, and he kept that church-state divide very, very much front and centre of his political campaign, whereas now you get Roy Moore saying you basically have to have Christian Sharia. And people like him. It's ridiculous. I saw a very funny clip from CNN last night. His chief spokesman said that Roy Moore had said that no Muslim could serve in the United States Senate because he couldn't swear on the Bible. And your man was totally stupefied when the host of the show said, well, you don't actually have to swear in a Bible. You can swear in whatever
text you want.
Or text you want. He didn't get that at all, because these people are so focused and narrow-minded on the idea of a Christian America, and a white Christian America.
I've raised this or said this before. I engage quite a lot with what I call Trumpers. I engage quite a lot, and it's a cult. It is a cult. I mean, I've had people tell me that Donald Trump is sent by Jesus.
Oh, God.
No, but I'm being honestly.
Oh, I know.
I've seen that. And they are sincere in what they say.
Yeah. That is a cult, because if anyone to think Donald Trump could be sent by God is beyond the realms of actual. I can't even express how I find that.
It's wrong on so many
But
levels.
We should understand, as a population, like, we've come out of an Irish Catholic theocracy, really. And that's what the Free State became when it was set up in the 1920s and 30s. Social policy and legislation was influenced hugely by the Catholic Church. If you look at all the legislation up to and including the 1937 Constitution, it was all influenced by the ideology of Roman Catholicism, and a very extreme form of Roman Catholicism. And then the 37 Constitution privileges the marital family, women in the home, God as the overarching, giving the overarching blessing to this new Ireland that we've created, a Catholic nation for a Catholic people. And it has taken us almost a century to overturn that and become a truly secular state. And we're not quite there yet. Because, of course, the Catholic Church has got derogations from the equality legislation in terms of the educational system, the big fight over the ethos ethos of hospitals, where the Catholic Church had been the founders of them, or the Catholic orders. And of course, we are now just coming to terms with our traumatic histories of institutionalization of inconvenient bodies, going back to where we started.
And even yesterday, the Minister Sapone saying that, well, softening the beachhead again with the, may never know.
How many were, yes.
Yeah. Actually,
the thing is, actually, we don't want to know, or certain parts of our population don't want to know. And that brings me right to what's driving me crazy these days, is the selling of the Magdalene Laundry on Sean McDermott Street, which was Gloucester Street, to a hotel chain that Dublin City Council are going to do that.
Mary, if you wouldn't mind, would you explain to us what Dublin City Council are doing there with this hotel?
Well, apparently the preferred bidder, and I didn't actually know they were selling it, for the Magdalene Laundry on, or the old Magdalene Laundry on Sean McDermott Street, is a hotel chain. Apparently the same hotel chain that bought Kinseely, believe it or not, and are going to develop out there. And it is a hotel chain run by a woman CEO that mostly employs women, and that's all very good. However, the point is, the Magdalene Laundry on Sean McDermott Street is the last one that closed in 1996. It is the most intact one. It doesn't have the actual laundry room itself, but the rest of it is all there. And it should be, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many who are Magdalene Laundry survivors and advocates and activists, and generally historians and people who are interested, feminists as well, in this whole story of ours, that it should be preserved as a site of memory and conscience for those women and those stories and those marginalised histories that occurred in institutions like that. But not just of them, of the Magdalene women, of the mother and baby homes, of the industrial schools, of the psychiatric hospitals. We had an awful history of institutionalisation in this state from its very beginning in 1922, sorry. We're a bit older than that. It had been happening before then, but from 1922 onwards, it becomes an integral part of the state's response to illegitimacy, to perceived lack of respectability and purity and morality among women, to poverty, to all those things it found inconvenient. And I think that word has been a theme of this podcast. Yeah. And to have that Magdalene Laundry in the middle of Dublin, on Sean McDermott Street, it is an opportunity to engage with the local community, to engage with the survivors of the Magdalene Laundries and other institutions, to engage with historians and feminist activists and working class activists and all the people who were affected by or who advocate around this area, to come up with a proposal that would respond to the community needs, to the survivor needs, and to everybody else who has an interest in this. And instead, they go to a bidding process and they're going to sell it to a hotel. Now, I know a capital city needs lots of hotels and we have lots of them, but really this is not the space for that.
No,
it reminded me, I teach a module in UCD on the master's programme in gender studies on gender, war and violence. And one of the case studies I look at one week is how places of violence, particularly violence against women, are used after all of that is over. And one of them that stands out for me is a place in Bosnia that was a rape camp used by the Serbian soldiers and all that whole awfulness around cultural and reproductive genocide by using women's bodies to breed away the Bosnian Muslim population particularly, and that awful trauma that those women suffered, as well as, of course, that their fathers and brothers and sons were all killed. Mm-hmm. And this was their suffering in this hotel. It's been turned into a spa hotel. And the women who were in this hotel and who were survivors talk about the re-traumatizing effect of that obliteration of their histories. Now people are swimming in hotels and taking saunas and treatments there.
If we take it in the context of where we are right now, we are talking about selling that on to become a hotel, and then invariably women and children who are now homeless will be put into that hotel.
Possibly.
So you have come full circle that you are again
institutionalizing these.
But this time you're neoliberal institutionalization.
Yes, it's no longer a religious practice.
Yes.
It's now
It's
an ideological practice.
Yeah.
But it
Yes.
was always ideological anyway.
Yeah,
Whether it was
now it's
motivated by religion or motivated by power, control, and money and economics.
I did a wonderful walking tour of Amsterdam this year with a guide, a historian guide, and there was a little asides. He kept coming up with these amazing little asides as we were going along, and he stopped and he said, "Oh, interesting enough, if you see this little sign above the thing, that's the East India Trading Company. And if you look across there, that was the West India Trading Company." And then he said straight out bluntly, because the Dutch can be very blunt and own their history. Yeah, and all these big fabulous houses, we paid for these with slavery.
Yeah, they did.
But he was just so, like, you know, because everybody else would have said, "Oh, we paid for it with cotton, or we paid for it with coffee, or we paid with it, you know, we traded commodities." No, we traded, we hollowed out, and the main resource was people. I think when you were talking to us there about the Magdalene Laundry, it's so important that we actually own what happened here, that we actually have that there as a centerpiece. So you can draw attention to it. It happened. It's real. Those people suffered, and we need to be able to actually remember it and actually learn from it.
And I think if something like that is there, it makes it harder for a neoliberal government or a particular ideological economic ideology to come into place that warehouses people again in family hubs or Butlins holiday camp where asylum seekers have been living for years. And it brings me back to the importance of history. Like, there's a fantastic guy down in Limerick, Liam Hogan, who does a huge amount of work on Irish slavery that whole meme that has gone around the world and has allowed a certain component of the Irish American story to be couched in terms of the Irish were slaves too, and sure, you know, why don't you get over it, to the African American community. And it, of course, demeans the real experience of slavery of the African American community. If the Irish can get over it, so can they, and what are they whinging about? Coming back to that whole idea that if you raise your voice as a woman or a person of colour, it's whinging. It's not authentic. It's not privileged. It's something you're just being silly.
Yeah.
And he's doing a huge amount of work to show that not only were the Irish not slaves, they were in a chattel system, of course, yes. And that was difficult, and that was a terrible history. No worse, though, than our history of institutionalisation here, I would argue. But he also shows that many of these slave owners in the Caribbean and places like that were Irish as well. And our experience, both as being colonised and colonisers, is something that we really need to develop a lot more of a complicated idea around as well. In the same way, we need to develop our ideas about institutionalisation. Blame the state, yes. Blame the church, yes. But families put their children and their and young women and others into institutions like psychiatric homes.
I heard it,
and things like that. And we haven't explored that. We've only started on the very surface of that, and that's going to explode the dark underbelly of Irish society as well.
I heard a terrible, terrible story about that in a girl who, or a woman, or maybe she was just a girl, young, who became pregnant. She was rowed out on, somebody rowed her out on a boat and into the middle of the ocean, and then they stepped onto another boat and just rowed back in and left her there. I heard that, and it was an anecdotal story, but that was how that's how that family, and it was her own father and brothers who did it.
Well, because the whole concept of stigma and shame was so connected with women's bodies, women's sexuality and women's reproductive bodies over, if we just take from the beginning of the state, and the dishonour, a young girl in a family pregnant outside marriage would bring to the family, shame them, bring down their status in society, all that sort of thing. And it was all bound up in women's bodies. So women's bodies were not seen as their own, as my own. My body wouldn't have been seen as my own. The state had an investment in it. The family had an investment in it. The church had an investment in it, and all wanted control.
On a I'm going to start bringing this towards the end, but on a positive note, okay? Change is very incremental, as we've said. It's, since 1922 to today, so nearly 100 years on. We're moving a couple of degrees maybe every year. We haven't got anywhere near a 180 degree turn to actually, and there's no real equality. But things that are, this is the week where they're going to vote now on the 8th committee.
Even looking at the newspaper today, they had a photograph of all the members of the committee, and only 3 were in red, 3 men who are going to vote contrary to what the recommendations of the committee. And of course, those are Matthew McGrath, Ronan Mullen, and the Fine Gael guy, Peter.
They were always going to be those.
And they just did not listen, they did not hear, they didn't want to know. Interestingly, quite a number of the other, both men and women on the committee, have said they changed their minds over the course of listening to experts. And this is where, the demeaned and derided expert and expertise does come into your own. There are experts in subjects. And you should listen to experts. And, I think the fact that people are going on about fake news and false facts and all that sort of thing has really muddied the water around the idea of expertise. But for me, to end on a positive note, I suppose for me, despite talking about homelessness, despite, the inconvenient voices, despite working on trauma histories like I do, I am positive for the future. Because I see young women and young men involved in activism now, in feminist activism, in working class activism, in homelessness activism. I mean, the energy of all those people who are involved in the Apollo House thing, the energy that people have in the Repeal the 8th campaign, the fact that feminism is now a buzzword. Now, obviously, there are fights within feminism, and there's the whole idea of, can you be a right-wing feminist? No. No, you can't. Because feminism is about equality, not just equality of gender.
I'm glad you said that. Thank you.
No, I would be very much now, my feminism is informed from intersectionality and the idea that we can't just look at gender, we can't just look at class, and we can't just look at race and all those in isolation. We have to see how they work in a patriarchal society to keep most people in their place and outside of privilege and power. They work mainly on women, but they also, a lot of men are excluded from powers because of the hierarchical nature of patriarchy as well. So we have to understand how the intersectional nature of racism, classism, sexism, homophobia all work together to create these hierarchies and exclusions and marginalizations. And the more people understand that, and the more people agree with that, the more that they're going to be active and fighting against the man. And
I think a point that brings that together, and a mutual friend of ours, Izzy, and a former friend on the pod, Izzy said it last night. She said, there we are, complaining about intersectionality, and there's John Connors speaking for us all.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
It really honed it in on the point.
Yeah, and he is speaking for us all. And I hope I would speak for a lot of people, not just me. I mean, I own my own privilege. I am a middle-class woman who has been very privileged to have a second and third level education. I work in the university. I know my privilege, but I also know my oppression as a woman, and how that has affected me in terms of my career, in terms of my life. I have experienced sexual harassment. I have experienced the fear walking home at night as a woman, thinking, somebody's coming up behind you. There is that operating as a woman in society. But I also know that there are women that are worse off than me, and there are men that are worse off than me. And in understanding how power works and how hierarchies of power work, I think when we understand, we can then disestablish it. We can activate against it. We can go up against it. Knowledge is power. Absolutely.
On a lighter note, have you anything planned for the Christmas? Are you a big Christmas person?
I am. And despite the fact that Donald Trump says his election has said now we can say Happy Christmas, I've said Happy Christmas for a year. I love Christmas. I'm going home to Kerry Come on, the kingdom.
Yes, and we're just saying your Kerry accent is so broad. It's been so difficult to understand.
So strong. Like a Healy ring.
Actually, I do have a bit of a North Kerry accent, because I saw a Ryark programme which was made in the 60s, in which my grandfather from Ballylongford in North Kerry, he was the chairman of the local church restoration committee, and they had put in, or committee, sorry, they had put in a tax on cows. However many cows you had, you paid £1 a year, or so if you had 20 cows, you paid £20 to restore the church. And actually, I thought, listening to him, he doesn't sound unlike me. I mean, I think my years in Dublin have flattened out what area I had.
Well, I don't know. We had Mick Clifford in, and
well, he's South Kerry, you see. There's a difference.
He's the beloved son of Kerry.
Yeah, but he's more. I love to say he sounds like he's from Cork.
You see, there are different. Kerry's a very big county, and there are different accents in North, South, and East and West Kerry. So you can tell where people are from. And I'm obviously from a little village near Listowel, Dewall. And that is a little bit of a different accent, but no, I don't have the broad North Kerry accent.
But you're looking forward to being in Kerry for the Christmas.
I do, and to go for walks by the sea, be by the Atlantic Ocean. I hope there's a bit of a storm. I love when the wild waves are
when it gives it all,
born in on top of us. But yes, and I'm looking forward to Kerry getting Sam back in.
Oh well, I think that's one thing you're going to be very disappointed in. I am sorry to say.
No, I think they'll come back.
Listen, Mary, thanks so much for coming on. Really, really a pleasure to have you here, and really appreciate you coming in.
It's great, thank you.
Yeah, no, it's great to come in. It's great to have the other voices come in and speak here, and to have the freedom to speak here. So we're delighted that you came in, and we both wish you a very Merry Christmas.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank you all for listening and remind you that you can subscribe to us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Take a minute, leave us a review, and don't forget to tell your friends. You can send us an email to theechochamberpod@gmail.com, or you can follow us on Twitter at echochamberspod. Thanks again, folks.